We'll get started. So welcome everybody to the Just webinar. Today we'll have Elisabeth Isaksen. So she's a senior research fellow at the Frisch Center for Economic Research in Oslo. And she'll be presenting her work on employment and earnings, losses in the green transition, lessons from the oil industry. And I will briefly introduce the project Adjust. So Adjust is a project funded by the European Union's Horizon Union program, and it stands for Advancing the Understanding of Challenges, Policy Options, and Measures to Achieve a Just EU Energy Transition. And the project has several objectives, including to increase the social support for climate transition strategies, quantify the distributional and competitiveness impacts of climate mitigation policies and transitional assistance measures, and also to understand the gaps in the capacity, motivation of public bodies to implement a just transition and to be able to identify actions to overcome them. Finally, this project, one of the goals is to promote inclusive procedural and transitional assistance measures supporting the achievement of a carbon neutral society in the EU. So there's some guidelines. So your audio and video are deactivated by default. But if you would like to intervene, and Elisabeth's happy to take questions during the webinar, but we also have 15 minutes towards the end for any Q&A. If you want to intervene for clarifications, you can raise your hand with the bottom button at the bottom of the screen, and I'll give you the floor, or you can also write in the Q&A session. Okay, and now I'll give the floor to Elisabeth, so I'll stop sharing.
Okay, so you can see my screen? Yeah. So thank you, Very. So what I will present today is joint work with Chloe at Oslo Met and Maria, who's at Stanford. And we're looking at implications for employment in earnings in transitioning to a greener economy. And we're looking at trying to learn some lessons from the oil industry. So the net zero transition, it will require a contraction in fossil fuel extraction and an expansion of different types of green industries and green jobs. Now we'll get back to exactly how we define green jobs. And for the workers that are employed in these contracting sectors, they will necessarily need to transition away from these types of jobs. And this will necessarily involve some transitional costs in terms of entering into unemployment, permanently leaving the labor force, or foregone earnings in terms of getting lower earnings in a new job, which could be due to a skill mismatch or lower employer premiums. But still, there's a lot of uncertainty about the magnitude of these transitional costs and also which type of workers find it easier or harder to transition into new lines of work. So some industries need to contract while others are projected to expand. And if these displaced petroleum workers or fossil fuel workers are able to relocate to sort of an expanding sector, green jobs, this could potentially ease the transition. So these petroleum workers, they don't necessarily need to enter into green jobs, but if there is sort of a skill overlap, if they can easily transition into these green jobs, it could sort of smooth the transition. As of now, there is limited empirical evidence on the extent of skill overlap between these types of workers and if petroleum workers actually transition into what we define as green jobs and also the earnings implications of doing so. So what we try to do in this paper is to quantify the transitional costs in terms of foregone earnings and entering into or not being employed in those that move away from fossil fuel extraction. So those that used to be employed in fossil fuel jobs what are the transitional costs of moving away from these jobs. And we want to see how these costs are distributed across different worker types. And then we want to see to what extent these oil workers transition into green jobs and what the earnings implications of doing so are. Since this question number 3 is a bit of a descriptive analysis, we want to try to get a bit closer to what can explain potential earnings gaps between those that move to different types of sectors. So we want to explore the role of skill overlap or skill mismatch, the role of employer premiums or industry premiums, and also to what extent there is systematic sorting of, say, more productive workers into certain types of industries. And the research context we are looking at in this paper is petroleum employment in Norway. So Norway is a big exporter of oil and natural gas, but sort of the actual extraction industry, they employ relatively modest share of the workforce, but there is a large ecosystem of manufacturing firms and service firms that cater to the extraction industry. So Statistics Norway, they have a broader definition of petroleum workers that includes also very petroleum-oriented manufacturing jobs. So this figure here, it shows oil workers broadly defined as a share of local labor market workforces as a share of the local labor market workforce. And you can see that there's sort of highest concentration along the coast, but we have oil workers across a lot of local labor markets in Norway. So you see that the share ranges from 0 to 1/4 of the workforce. So what we're trying to do in this paper is we haven't seen a big transition away from oil in Norway, but there was a very big negative shock that hit the petroleum sector around 10 years ago. So there was a very sharp and sudden decline in the oil price in the summer of 2014. That was very sudden. So the oil price fell from $110 per barrel to around 35 in just a few months. And this was associated with a sharp decline in petroleum employment. There was first a buildup, but then there was a big decline. So what we're trying to do is to exploit this shock to say something about transitional costs. So our paper relates to at least 3 strands of literature. So first, there is a strand of literature that looks at worker level transitional costs. So these are papers that follow individual workers after a type of shock and see sort of how they develop after the shock. So most of the literature, it focuses on, say, trade-induced shocks, technology-induced shocks. Some use mass layoffs as a shock to the individual worker. But there are relatively few papers that focus more on sort of a brown-green transition and also focus on sort of shocks that hit carbon-intensive industries. So that's where we see our contribution here. There's also a large literature on resource booms and busts. I would say there's more papers focusing on booms rather than busts, and they often focus on geographical areas and those employed in a certain geographical area that experience a boom or a bust. An advantage with our data is that we can follow the individual worker instead of just a geographical unit, because even though a geographical area might be hard hit, if workers are able to transition into new lines of work, then sort of looking at the geographical unit might overstate the negative effects. There's also some papers looking specifically at this shock in Norway, but they have a slightly different focus than our paper. Since we're trying to see to what extent workers transition into green jobs or green industries, we also relate to a literature, so a relatively small but growing literature trying to define a green job or green skill or green occupations, which is not straightforward. So we're contributing to that literature. The existing papers have a different focus by trying to sort of define what we mean by a green job or a green skill, but we're looking at to what extent different types of petroleum workers transition into these green jobs. And we also have quite granular data to try to define green jobs at a more granular level. So this is the roadmap for the rest of the talk. So I'll talk briefly about the data, and then the first part of the analysis, we're looking at sort of the direct effect of the shock for all of those that were employed in the oil sector 1 year prior to the shock. And then in the second step, we're focusing in on those that separate from their initial oil employer and see where they go after they separate from the 2013 employer. And then we want to see how these transitional costs are distributed. And then lastly, we want to see to what extent they transition from oil to green and the implications of that. So the core data set we're using is a linked employer-employee data. So we have data from 5 years prior to the shock. And we recently extended the data set from 2018 to 2023. So we just updated the analysis. So we can follow each individual worker over time. So we know all the job spells, so the start and end dates, the earnings associated with that job spell, and the occupations of the individuals. And for this data, we have an individual ID and an establishment ID that allows us to link this data set with different types of information. So we have data on individuals. We're mainly exploiting data from the tax returns, so their annual income, wealth, different transfers, and also different demographics such as gender and educational attainment. And for the establishment and firm level data, we're using some different variables and sources to try to say something about whether a job is an oil job or a non-oil job, and also use this data to try to define green jobs, carbon-intensive jobs, and other jobs in the economy. So I'll get back to it on the next slide. And some key outcomes we're looking at is the employment status, whether you're employed or unemployed. We can also go more detailed into if you exit the labor force, if you retire, etc. And the second outcome is annual labor earnings. We're also measuring hourly wages, but that is measured with a bit of noise. So we're putting more focus on the first two variables. So since an aim of this project is to look to examine to what extent oil workers transition into green jobs or remain in more carbon-intensive jobs, we need to define green in some way. And this is not sort of straightforward how to do it. So what we've done in this paper, first we start with just using the 5-digit industry code, and we're listing a set of industries that we define as green. So say renewable industries and some additional industries, but this is a quite narrow definition of green jobs. So what we try to do is to expand the definition a bit and define a specific firm and the workers in that firm as green if they have a high share of exports of green goods, if they have a high share of green R&D, or a high share of climate-related patents. So I won't go into all the details, but this is sort of a bit arbitrary exactly where which cutoffs we choose for these different measurements. But we're trying to sort of capture firms that sort of contributes to a green transition. And also we define green along the occupation dimension as well. So we're using those occupations in I think maybe the 95th percentile of greenness in terms of skills that we take from an occupation classification. So we use those sources to define a job as green, and then we have some other sources to define a job as brown and non-oil. So we're using firm level CO2 emissions and also using the industries that are part of the EU ETS. So based on these sources, you get a sense of the magnitude of these sectors. Of course, it's sensitive to the different cutoffs we're using, But with this cutoff, then the green sector is around the same magnitude as the oil sector in terms of employment. Brown is half of the green and oil sector, and then, of course, the largest sector is all other jobs. So in the first part of the paper, we're trying to look at the direct effect of the shock. So first, just a sample restriction. We're focusing on those employed in a private sector firm and aged and are between 24 and 60, let me see, 61, measured in 2013. But then they are allowed to move into the public sector after or before the shock. But we're defining the sample based on characteristics in 2013. And then our starting point is we're defining sort of the treatment group as individuals that were employed in a petroleum-related job in the year prior to this oil price shock. And then we're defining a control group where we identify 5-digit industries that had close to zero deliveries to the oil sector. So we want to have industries that are to a much lesser extent affected by this oil price drop. And since these two groups are quite different in terms of worker characteristics and industry characteristics, we want to improve the comparability a bit. So we're trimming the control group to make it more similar to the treatment group. So we're doing some propensity score matching to improve the pre-balance. So we're ensuring that each oil worker is matched to a control worker that has the same pre-shock earnings, the same age, the same gender, the same educational attainment, and lives in the same county, and also has the same employment status prior to the shock. So I think maybe I'll just skip the summary statistics, but we have around 70,000 individuals in the sample. So these two figures, it just shows the raw mean for these two groups. So the red line shows the development in employment and log labor earnings for those that were employed in the oil sector in 2013, so the year prior to the oil price shock. And the blue line indicates the development for the control group. So as we can see for the oil group, we see that there was a sharper decline in employment and in log labor earnings. So this was just the raw data, and then we're running a relatively standard diff and diff regression, where we just indicate whether the worker was employed in oil in the year prior to the shock, and then we're including some different time-varying controls. So we're including individual fixed effects, year we allow each local labor market to develop differently over time, and also each age to develop differently over time. So we're only comparing individuals within those the same labor market and within the same age group. So as we saw from just the raw descriptive figures, we see that there was a decline in employment probability and log labor earnings for the ones that were employed in the petroleum sector. So this is what we label sort of as the direct effect. So what we see is, if you look at log labor earnings, we look at everyone that were employed in the oil sector in 2013, we see that their earnings dropped by 10% in 2017, but then they recover over time. And if we only focus on those that remain employed, then we see that they almost recover after 10 years in terms of log labor earnings. However, if we split this group of employed oil workers and we separate it into two groups based on those that remained at their initial employer and those that separated from their initial employer. This is, of course, a descriptive graph because it is based on how on sort of post-shock outcomes. But what we see from this descriptive graph is that these earnings losses is primarily driven by those that separate from their initial oil employer. And if anything, those that remain, they gain over time. So what we want to do in the remaining parts of the presentation and in the paper, we're focusing on those that separate from their 2013 employer. And one motivation is because a green transition will necessarily require people to transition out of oil. And we're mostly interested to see where they go and how these transitional costs are distributed across different types of workers. So in order to, since people separate from their oil employer at different points in time, we're doing some slight modifications to the empirical strategy. So instead of defining the year of the oil price shock as the intervention year, then we're recentering the intervention year to the year that the oil workers separate from their employer. So in this way, we run a staggered diff and diff. So basically, we recenter the intervention year to the year where they separate. But each oil worker, they will be assigned a control worker with sort of a placebo displacement year. And we're controlling for the same types of year times labor market fixed effects and age fixed effects and individual fixed effects. So when we recenter the intervention year to the year when they separate from their employer, then we see that there is, not surprisingly, a big drop in employment. So a lot of those that separate, they move into, or they're not employed in that year, and then they recover over time. So those that separate, so we're focusing on those that separate in the 4 years after the shock, because this is more likely related to the oil price shock. So that's around 20,000 workers. So we see that they immediately have sort of a big negative hit, but then they partly recover over time, but not fully. So still after 10 years, labor earnings are around 10% lower. If you look at other margins, we see that so unemployed here is defined as those that receive unemployment benefits and are not linked to an employer. So what we see that there's a temporarily spike in unemployment, but then it goes down. So after around 5 years, then these displaced oil workers are not more likely to be unemployed compared to the control workers. But what we see is that the oil workers are more likely to exit the labor market in terms of retirement and in terms of receiving disability benefits. So some of them sort of exit the labor market, and that's why you see, even though unemployment is going down, then some of them temporarily or permanently leave the labor force. If you look at how these transitional costs are distributed across different worker types, here is just some selected worker characteristics. And the first plot shows probability of being employed, and the second plot shows log labor earnings. So some heterogeneous results that we find is that probability of being employed and also the negative effect on labor earnings is systematically correlated with age. So those older workers, these are age here is measured in 2013. So those that would be 54 in 2013, they will be 64 by the end of the period. So this shows how those in that age group, 45 to 54, they experience the largest losses. And also we see that there is a clear skill gradient. So those with less than high school, they take a much harder hit than those with higher educational attainment. So that's two clear patterns that we see in the data. Low education and older workers, they face larger negative effects. We can also look at heterogeneous effects along other dimensions. Here we're looking at effects by occupation. And we don't see a very clear pattern. So among those that experience the smallest losses, we both have managers and elementary workers, which are cleaners, kitchen assistants, etc. So we don't see sort of a clear pattern that it's the low or high skilled when we rank these occupations. But there might be some indications of professionals and managers taking a slightly smaller hit than, say, clerical workers, service workers. So in the last part of the paper and also in this presentation, we're focusing on, do these oil workers transition into green jobs? And if they do, what are the earnings implications? And what can explain potential earnings gaps between sectors? So first, just a descriptive figure. This first figure here, it just shows the share of the oil workers that separate from their initial employer. How many goes to another oil job, another green job, a brown job, or goes into another job in the economy. And we see just from the descriptives that most oil workers, they remain in oil, so they leave for and are employed at another oil firm. And also a relatively small share, so around 7%, move into a green job. But these shares, of course, also reflect the size of these sectors. So the fact that 40% go to other jobs partly reflect that other jobs make up a much larger share of the economy than green jobs. So if we instead measure the number of oil workers as a share of the size of these receiving sectors, then we see that oil workers, they make up a larger share of the green sectors than other sectors. So if you sort of scale by the size of the receiving sector, we see that they disproportionately more go into green than into other types of jobs. In this figure here, again, it's a bit of a descriptive figure, but what we've done is that we've split this treatment group of oil workers according to which destination sector they move to. So here you see the development in log labor earnings for those that go into other carbon-intensive jobs and oil jobs, and we see they are almost similarly, they are less negative off and develop very similarly, while those that go to green, they are a bit worse off, and those that go to other jobs are the ones that are worse off in terms of declines in labor earnings. So what we want to do now is to explain why do labor earnings decline so much more if you go to other jobs than if you go to a carbon-intensive job. And you see green jobs is somewhere in between. So how much is due to, say, brown and oil jobs just being industries that pays a high wage premium, or they have employers that have a high wage premium in general that is not linked to this specific worker, but they just are higher paying firms? And to what extent is this earnings gap due to those that move into carbon and high carbon and oil? They have sort of a closer match in skills than those that move to other types of jobs. So there might be sort of a premium, an industry-specific premium that, so your skills might be more applicable in other carbon-intensive jobs than in other types of jobs. So I won't have time to go into the details how we define these variables, but I can just explain very quickly. So to measure employer wage premiums, we run sort of a very standard AKM model. It's just a regression where we have the log of wages on the left-hand side, and then we have some control variables on the right-hand side. And what we are interested in is establishment fixed effects, which are this blue element here. So we're basically taking these establishment fixed effects from a regression that is run on the entire economy, and then we're teasing out sort of some time variant differences in the wages that are paid by different types of employers. So that's how we get the employer wage premium. To measure skill distance, we are measuring so we have for each occupation, we have a vector of 35 skills that are important in that occupation. And then what we're doing is that we're measuring the distance between all occupations. So the Euclidean distance between two occupations, and then we're measuring the distance to the job that you had in 2013 to the job that you have after you've been displaced. So first, in this figure here, we have as the outcome variable, we have these establishment premiums, which is a time invariant variable. But the reason why it can change over time is because a worker can go from one employer to another employer. So then they will get assigned a different establishment premium. So what we see is that those that move to green jobs or other jobs, they move to employers that generally pay a lower wage premium. If you look at the skill distance to the 2013 job, we see that those that move to other types of oil jobs, they move to jobs that are closer in the skill space than those that move to other types of jobs. So what we see is that other oil jobs are more similar in the skill space to the initial employment, and then the ranking is brown, green, and other. And so now we documented that those that go to different types of sectors, this is associated with, so those that go to other jobs, they go to jobs that are further away in the skill space than those that go to oil jobs. But what we want to examine in the last part of the analysis is how much of this matters for the earnings that they get. So we see that there's a difference in the skill distance, but does this matter for the earnings, or is it explained by other factors? So the last thing we do is to use an approach called, that's sort of a decomposition approach, where we try to decomposition the earnings gap between those that go to a green job and those that go to an oil job, and what part of this gap can be explained by different factors. So if we compare those that go to a green job and an oil job, we see that the most important factor explaining this negative earnings gap for those that go to green is that they go to an employer with a lower establishment premium. So this is indicated by the delta est FE, which is establishment fixed effects. We see that the skill distance explains some of this difference, but establishment premiums is more important in explaining this negative earnings gap. If you look at some worker characteristics, we see that the younger workers are more likely to sort into green jobs, and in isolation, that would indicate that there was a positive earnings gap. So if anything, this characteristic, it goes against explaining this earnings gap. So in isolation, it would lead to a lower earnings gap. But generally, establishment fixed effects are that factor that explains the most. So if you look at other jobs, so the rest of the economy, then again, you see establishment fixed effects is the one that explains the most. And if anything, age would indicate in isolation that the gap would be smaller than it actually is. So just to give a quick recap of what we found. So and now I'm mainly focused on the displaced workers. In the paper, we also elaborate a bit more on sort of these direct effects on all oil workers. But if you look at the displaced oil workers, we see that they experienced a substantial drop in labor earnings and employment. And they don't, even after 10 years, they don't fully recover after this being displaced from their initial employment. We do see some heterogeneous patterns. Older workers are worse off, and also those with less than high school are worse off than those with a university degree. We do see that displaced workers disproportionate transition into green jobs compared to other types of jobs if we account for the size of the receiving sector. We see that earnings losses for those that switch to green jobs, they are larger than those that go go to other carbon-intensive jobs or oil jobs, but it's also smaller than those that go to other types of jobs. We also see that green jobs are closer in the skill space to oil jobs compared to other jobs in the economy. But since employer wage premiums, they explain a lot more than skill mismatch or skill distance. Employer wage premiums is sort of the most important factor when we're looking at earnings gaps. So our findings is suggest transitional costs for fossil fuel workers. And since skill mismatch or only explain a small part of the earnings gap, even if we so targeted policies aimed at skill development alone will not fully restore prior earning levels, because part of it is due to an industry rent or an establishment rent in the oil sector and in compared to other types of sectors. But since we see that those that move to green jobs are better off than those that go to other types of jobs, and these are closer in the skill space than other types of jobs, it could potentially ease the transition or help smooth the transition if the green sector is expanding, and it could offset some of their earnings losses compared to if they need to transition into other types of jobs. So that was all I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisabeth. Very interesting presentation and also very nice use of the data. Now we'll open it up for Q&A from the audience. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand, or feel free to type it in the chat. So while people think of questions, meanwhile, I wanted to ask you also some questions about your study. No, I found it super interesting that you used the 2014 oil price shock. Could you speak a little bit more about how you think this shock might capture sort of what the future climate policy in this transition might look like, and sort of what we can say from this experience and what we cannot say?
Yeah, so we're a bit careful with sort of claiming that this would be exactly the same as sort of imposing a higher carbon price or having sort of a permanent transition away from oil. Some similarities with the oil price drop and say a carbon price could be that a carbon price, it will increase the consumer price, but it will lower the producer price. So in that sense, sort of a lower oil price could resemble an effect of a higher carbon price if they're not able to fully pass through the carbon cost or the carbon tax. So in that sense, there are some similarities with imposing a carbon tax. One thing that would be a bit different with a sort of permanent closure of a sector is that we sort of have a decline in the sector, but then sort of it partly recovers and there are still available jobs in the petroleum sector. So not everyone needs to transition out of oil. But the idea is that we're hoping to shed some light on what types of what are the magnitude of these transitional costs in moving away from oil, and that could potentially be informative of sort of a future green transition where we will need to sort of scale down this sector. But of course, a lot depends on the context and the different measures implemented and other opportunities. So yeah, so we try to be a bit careful about extrapolating too much.
Thank you. I see we have a raised hand from Ines. Give me just a second to give her the floor. Ines, can you?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi. Thank you, Elisabeth, for this presentation. I'm not sure if you also did interviews with the employed people or asked them for soft factors. I would be interested in why people still want to stay in the oil industry, although it's not really, I would say, a future industry, given the transition we have ahead of us, and what motivates them to stay in there and what motivated the people who went to the green jobs. And if there is any chance to motivate more people to go there. So I would like to know more about this if possible. Thank you.
Yeah. So obviously there are a lot of advantages with this type of data. A disadvantage is that it's hard to say anything about people's motivation. A clear motivation is that there is a substantial wage premium still in oil. So a lot of workers will need to take a wage cut if they move into other sectors. So, but we haven't done any, we're not relying on any sort of surveys or data sets that try to get to the motivation for why they leave or why they stay. But it's probably a mix of factors. But yeah, so I think that would be, we would need to complement this question with other types of research or papers that have different data sources. So fortunately, it's hard with this administrative data to speculate in the motivations, but we could always say something about what is attractive and less attractive about jobs, and obviously the pay is an attractive part of the oil jobs.
But this is a bit against what we know from a lot of studies, that wage is not the most important factor anymore, especially if it's higher skilled jobs. It's much more the purpose, the meaning of what you do, the way they treat you, and so on. So
Yeah,
that's why
so
I'm a bit
that
puzzled.
definitely matters as well. Yeah.
Mm. But you are not planning to do any interviews or motivational research, because I think it would be quite interesting for a just. Or I don't know if others are doing it. If Elena is here, she can always say something here. Thank you, Elisabeth.
Yeah, I think you would need to other types of research will potentially, hopefully complement this type of analysis, and then yeah. So Jared.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Elisabeth. Thanks for
Hey.
the really cool, interesting paper. I just have a few questions, and you can just answer the ones that you want to answer. The first was around if you could say anything about the actual types of green jobs that are available or that workers are moving into. Like if you have that degree of granularity, and ideally if you could say something about the sort of the specific types of oil sector jobs they're leaving and the specific types of green jobs that they're going into. I'm just curious, like what are the kind of emerging green jobs in Norway? And then was there any policy support during this transition? Because that would get us maybe closer to seeing, to how close this resembles a sort of government-induced transition away from fossil fuels. If there was policy support for displaced oil workers, say to retrain, et cetera. There probably wasn't. I mean, yeah, I'm guessing you would have already looked at this, but you could obviously compare those that got this support to those that didn't, and see if the policy had any effect in sort of getting workers to move into different sectors.
Yeah.
And then just in terms of sort of external validity, and I'm thinking, so oil. So, I mean, yeah, so oil workers get paid a lot of money. Oil workers in Norway get paid a lot of money. And when there's a shock to the system, a market shock, that looks like they just kind of wait it out and try to get their good job back and their high earnings back. And that makes sense. But would it be the same for other fossil fuels? So for coal, for example, right? Depending on the country, coal workers might actually be paid less or have worse working conditions. So therefore, a similar market shock might actually create more of an incentive to leave the sector. I don't know. I mean, again, this is sort of speculation, external validity, but curious what you think about that. Like, to what extent we can generalize from this case. And then lastly, picking up on what was said by, and I'm forgetting her name, but the woman hosting the event. I think it's interesting, a sort of market shock versus a government-induced transition away. And one key difference, and you talked a little bit about this, Elisabeth, but one key difference is, again, I mean, it's totally different incentives. So for the market shock, again, it just seems like you would just wait it out, right? And wait for the sector to recover. And it seems like that's what a lot of workers did. Whereas a kind of permanent, governed decline of a sector would create, it seems like totally different incentives for workers to change. Anyways, I'll leave it there. Thanks so much, Elisabeth. Really interesting.
Yeah, so these are all very good comments and things we have at least thought about, maybe not, or to a smaller, larger extent, try to address a bit in the papers. So when it comes to the type of jobs, it didn't make it into the presentation, but we do have in the appendix of the paper, we do have sort of detailed information about what type of green jobs they move into and what type of brown jobs they move into. And we could also look at which type of oil jobs they move from. So this is possible to do with the data. So from my recollection is the type of green jobs, I think, is very sort of engineer based. I can't remember the details, but this is something that we definitely have information about and that could be interesting to discuss a bit more. When it comes to specific policy support, so generally this type of analysis needs to be interpreted in the light of sort of the Norwegian welfare state, and we have sort of general training and coursing as part of sort of the unemployment agency or employment and welfare agency that gives sort of more general support. I don't know about specific initiatives that were very targeted to the oil sector. So it's more sort of general retraining and recoursing programs. But definitely a shock like that would probably develop differently in a setting where you didn't have sort of this welfare state in the background. And yeah, this waited out. There definitely was an element that some people were sort of laid off, or they were sort of temporarily laid off, and they were waiting it out to sort of hoping to return to the oil sector or to their original job, and that would be different if there was a more permanent phase down of the sector. So definitely that's something that would be a bit different. And also, yeah, like you said, market shock versus government induced. If there was sort of a planned process of phasing out a sector, that would be different than sort of a negative shock, and people are hoping that it will sort of return back to the baseline again. So this sort of has implications for the external validity, or to what extent we can extrapolate from this shock to what we can learn in sort of a green transition where you need to permanently phase out these types of jobs. So yeah, point well taken. Yeah, so I think these are things we have thought about that we to smaller, lesser extent are discussing a bit in the paper. Yeah. Thanks, Jared. So I think you're muted.
Thank you. So unless there are any other questions, we can begin to wrap up. And I don't see any more in the chat. Okay, but okay, well, thank you very much, Elisabeth, and thank you very much to the people that are attending. Hope you found it as interesting as I did, and yeah, we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you.
good summer, everyone.
Thank you.